celebrity historian Raffi Andonian has really been looking at how do we get history into people's perspective who might not otherwise be there. Today, we're going to talk about interpreting historic monuments. And if you look at that in the context of the Capitol, right now, one of the big conversations that's going on is how do we deal with monuments that are in the Capitol, statues in particular, that honor individuals who served the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis, Alexander Hamilton Stevens still stand in the Capitol. Many advocates have called for their removal, and already there have been a systematic replacement of several Confederate generals. Just last year, Edmund Kirby Smith was replaced by Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune, representing Florida. Uriah Milton Rose from Arkansas is slated to be replaced by Johnny Cash, and Virginia has already removed Robert E. Lee's statue with a plan to bring Barbara Rose Johns, a civil rights educator, in the place. And these debates about Confederate monuments really raise fundamental questions about our national identity and what values do we prioritize in how that is represented in what historical figures we choose to honor. These monuments represent a particular interpretation of history, often symbolizing complex and painful aspects of our nation's past, including racism, inequality, and the legacy of the Civil War and slavery. Raffi Andonian will provide an open-ended framework for understanding and evaluating historic sites, figures, and symbols, encouraging an informed dialogue about the significance of these monuments. He's got an interesting story to tell. He's the author of 3 history books, including Creating Space for Conflicted Histories, which is now an Amazon bestseller. He has taken his passion for history and used that to create a business. He's an entrepreneur, a celebrity who uses history to provide special tours that tell history, but also to provide employee engagement programs so that we look at our history and what do we learn from our history about our time together and our future. So Raffi began his career at the Gettysburg battlefield. He's been involved with the Richmond Civil War sites, the Martin Luther King Childhood Home, and the Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the atomic bomb was created. So Raffi, this is a fascinating story you have to tell. Take us away and talk about what do we have as monuments and what does that mean?
All righty. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It means a lot to me to be at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society because, as you may have surmised, I lived in the area in the East Coast for some time. I live in St. Louis now, and it means a lot to me to come back and talk in this sort of forum and tie some of these themes from my different experiences and work together. So thank you guys. And I'm sharing screen here. I just want to make sure that we see it. Yep, it looks like we see it. So, are your monuments worthy? Take the quiz. That's kind of one of my big key questions I ask, because we're often asking ourselves, are our monuments worthy? Are your monuments worthy? Whatever your monuments are in your community, your state, your city, your local school, maybe. So I created this set of questions that we could use to approach these monument and historic site controversies. And we're going to walk through some of them with some very specific examples, especially focused on the Civil War, but drawing from different areas. So my story with this, the most powerful moment, begins when I was at the Martin Luther King home. I was standing on that porch that you see there, the front porch of the Martin Luther King home when he was a child, his birth and childhood home up to age 12 in Atlanta. And I was a park ranger. I worked at multiple Park Service sites, and this is a National Park Service site. And what I was doing is I was leading a tour. I was leading a tour of a group of kids aged between 9 to maybe 12 or 13 in that preteen age, maybe 10 to 12 of them, and maybe about a dozen, and a chaperone. And I noticed with the kids that some of them had the backs of their necks kind of lashed. Others had, one of them had the skull pushed in, like the back of his head pushed in. Another one had scarring on his arms. And I was thinking, what's going on here? You know, his kids had clearly been through a lot. And what I discovered, this is in the year 2010, that they were enslaved refugees. That is, that they were former slaves in Haiti, and they had escaped only recently. And the place that they wanted to come, according to their chaperone, in one of their early orientations to the new country, was a Martin Luther King related historic site, in this case, the birth home. No, they didn't know that the birth home was there before they arrived, but they knew the legacy of Martin Luther King and wanted to visit a site related to Martin Luther King. And what that really showed me, at that point, having worked at Gettysburg and in Richmond, was more than ever before the power of historic sites. Because here I was standing on that porch with kids who wanted to engage with the legacy of someone they had never met, but someone they had heard of, and they wanted to do it through a sense of place, by engaging and being here, the site that was connected to King. Now, historic sites and monuments are different things, and we're going to walk through that a little bit when we go through my set of questions. But for our purposes, we're going to apply the questions to both while understanding that historic sites, which is a location that something took place, such as this home, is a different thing than a monument, such as the statues in Statuary Hall in the Capitol. So let's start with the first question of the quiz that I created based on my experiences. Why remember? What is the significance being remembered? That's the first question I would start with. Y'all mentioned the atomic bomb in my bio. I worked at Los Alamos, as Jane mentioned. And look at that symbol there on the left, the mushroom cloud. That's a bomb at Nagasaki. That's a photo from the Library of Congress. Very powerful symbol, right? It gives us a certain evocative reaction. How about in the top there, the gadget? You might have heard of that if you watched the movie Oppenheimer that won all kinds of Academy Awards. While they were creating the bomb at the Manhattan Project, they referred to the experimental bomb as a gadget in order to help hide what it actually was in case the word got out. And there's me talking about it in New Mexico on television. These stories are always interconnected and personal to me. But what's the significance of the atomic bomb? Forget if you like it or don't like it for a moment, but let's focus on the significance. Whether you're focusing on soldiers' lives that were saved by not doing an additional invasion on the American side, or you're focusing on the death and destruction of the bomb itself for the Japanese, or you're focusing on the technology it led to, including nuclear medicine that has saved lives. Those are all different things that are very complex, but certainly we can, I think, agree that there was significance. Let's look locally in DC and within the US Capitol to try to apply that same question. On the left, we have Roger Taney. You might have heard of Taneytown, Maryland, also named after him. That was a bus that was in the US Capitol until recently. And on the right, we have Thurgood Marshall. Of course, Chief Justice, just as Taney was more than a century before him. Taney, famous for authoring the Dred Scott decision. I'm right here in St. Louis. I live in St. Louis. Dred Scott case started right here in St. Louis, ties Missouri, and of course, Washington together. The Supreme Court case that, among other things, decided that Black folks did not have rights to citizenship because Dred Scott had sued for his freedom based on the fact that he had traveled to free states as an enslaved person. And so Roger Taney's legacy, of course, in recent years has been revisited. And isn't it interesting that we look to Thurgood Marshall, who also later became a Chief Justice, but started his career as a civil rights attorney, most famously for Brown versus Board of Education, overturning segregation. Now you can see two very different stories, right? One says Black folks do not have the same rights as citizens. The other erased Plessy or overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which was for segregation. So it was trying to be access for further civil rights on the basis of avoiding racial discrimination. Contrasting stories, contrasting figures. Before I question here, both significant, right? Both significant and influential. The Dred Scott case influenced things? Absolutely. The Thurgood Marshall influenced things? Absolutely. So for our question, without getting into the other questions yet, the first thing I think we need to talk about in dialogue is, why remember? The next question, what is a history being remembered? This is where we have to establish what actually happened. I kind of started to creep into that when I started talking about, for example, the specifics of the Dred Scott case on the prior slide. Let's look over here. Let's look at some petroglyphs in New Mexico on the lower left. Those are artwork by indigenous peoples across many centuries. And while many people look at these and interpret, it's very challenging to know what are we actually remembering there. You'll have all kinds of theories, but it's very challenging to understand what the interpretation is. When you're trying to interpret art, it's very difficult to understand. We have theories, but this question is not always as simple as we think. I put there a photo in the upper right on gas shortage and inflation. And that was a big topic. Well, inflation's been a big topic, but specifically gas prices, when they were spiking up about 2 years ago, was a big topic, and the comparisons to the 1970s were being made. Although there were different economic and historical context situations, which I think is part of what we discuss when we talk about what is a history being remembered. There's different policies and different both political and economic policies in place, which make it a different context before we rush to those comparisons. Or how about with Putin? He certainly has been referring to remembering a certain history, tying to Kievan Rus to justify his invasion. So this question of what is a history to be remembered can be tricky. Let's look here in the US and tie back to the Capitol as well. Manifest Destiny, you see that painting over there on the right. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. Maybe you haven't seen it since one of your textbooks in history, but I'm sure you've seen it around. Lady Liberty or Columbia marching across the West, bringing lightness from the East to the darkness of the West. That's what you're seeing depicted there. And we could sit here analyzing all sorts of components within that painting, as I've done in other scenarios. But the basic idea, of course, is that it was clear, it was manifest that our destiny as the United States was to expand from sea to shining sea and bring that civilization as they saw it. And I put that in quotes, a civilization to the folks who needed progress with the railroad that you see as the buffalo are being pushed out. One of the biggest advocates for that was Thomas Hart Benton. And you can see him right here. And this is the monument that was at U.S. Statuary Hall that is now at the State Historical Society of Missouri. That's my photo. I walked up to it and took it. Benton was a big advocate for Manifest Destiny, and he was part of bringing Missouri into the United States as a slave state, himself a slave owner. And so that might be the story that we tell, right? What is the history? Remember, what if I told you that he also was unhappy with the Compromise of 1850, 30 years after the Missouri Compromise, because he thought it was too friendly to pro-slavery interests? What if I told you that he also lost his Senate seat because he was seen as not being supportive of the expansion of slavery? So let's look at the complexity of the story here, of when we try to tell the story of what is a history to be remembered. This is why we can have debates. This is why sometimes a story breaks down when one of us focuses on one or the other. We don't see the whole picture of what is the history to be remembered. That makes the conversation more complicated. Now, I'm not saying yet that in this process of asking questions that this necessarily means that we know the answer. Not necessarily the case. But what it does mean for our second question is we have to establish a full picture of what is history. Remember, manifest destiny can be seen for some of its pluses and minuses. I'll give you a quick example of how sometimes someone can interpret something. And we look at manifest destiny and say, oh yeah, that's clearly, all negative, right? Bad things to indigenous people, this notion of civilization, etc. But I had someone recently, for example, say, I just realized I do the same thing. Because I'm always advocating that instead of doing this individualism that Americans seem to believe in, that I think that we should have development for public transit and mass transit throughout the United States. That is the way I believe it is, and I feel like there is no other answer. And looking at this painting and analyzing it, and looking at the way they portray the railroad as a particular version of technology and progress, made her question if she should always be thinking that this is the only answer. So I want you to see, when you're looking at what is history, remember, I want to encourage us to look at the multiple angles and the full picture before we jump to what the answer is. The third question, what does it mean to remember? So this is where we get a little bit into some of the monuments versus sites. Let's start in the middle there. You see the columns, the building with the columns. That's the White House of the Confederacy. And the White House of the Confederacy is a historic site. It's a place. It's a place, there's only one White House of the Confederacy. You can't, I can't put it across the street in St. Louis. I guess I can move the building, but I'm saying I can't pretend that I'm going to create the White House of the Confederacy across the street. That's a little bit different than the monument. On the left, there is a Robert E. Lee monument, which Jane mentioned. That one is the one on Monument Avenue. Of course, has been in the news for a few years. A few years ago, it was big time in the news, but still kind of pops up occasionally. And what does it mean to remember? What does it mean to set aside a historic site where something occurred, even if it's not always a pretty story? In the case of the Confederacy, a nation that is founded to protect slavery, versus putting a monument up. And what is that monument really trying to tell us? What does it mean? Is it condemning? Is it condoning? Is it celebrating? We have to ask the question. Simply the presence of the site or the monument is not enough. It's the nature of what is taking place there. I'll give you a funny example that's right there on your screen. If you look in the top there, there is 4 of us standing in front of a monument. That's me as an intern at Gettysburg before I got a job there in the green shirt. And we're standing in front of a Civil War soldiers monument taking a goofy photo because some of those men in the unit were also Penn State alum. That is a bunch of Penn Staters, myself included, as an undergrad, who decided to take a photo in front of the monument because that's what it meant to us. So I think sometimes we have to ask, what does it mean to remember? What does that photo mean to me? What was I intending when I stood in front of that monument? Because someone may look at that and extrapolate other things, depending on what you're seeing. Now, incidentally, that's me on the right with an Emmy having covered exactly this question on a contested site and what it meant with a conquistador figure out west. So this is a question that is obviously very relevant. I always am struck by, sometimes you get this notion of, well, history, it's not as important as, say, STEM fields. And I love STEM fields, I think those are important too, but think about the 1619 project. Or you may love it or hate it. I'm not here to tell you to love or hate it. What I am here to help you understand with that is, aren't we debating what does it mean to remember the country with 1619 as a founding year as opposed to 1776? Isn't that question really relevant? Why do we get so worked up over it if it wasn't that important? And that's why television puts this stuff on, and that's why it's still relevant, because we fight over this stuff. So carrying that notion of memorializing over, and let's look inside the Capitol. As Jane mentioned, the Robert E. Lee Monument has now been replaced inside the Capitol. You see it there on the left. And I think this is a fascinating figure and story. I know you all are familiar with Robert E. Lee. The question for our purposes in this third part of the 4 questions that I have is, if I'm having a conversation with representatives of the communities and stakeholders that should be present in this conversation, this is one of the questions I would ask. What does it mean to remember? What are we really doing here in that context of putting that monument? Or what if we look at the flag, the Confederate battle flag? There are multiple Confederate flags. The Confederacy had many flags, but the one that we remember most is the one that popped up later, a couple generations later, of course, with the white supremacy movement. And so we, of course, attach the historical memory to the Confederacy based on the fact that it was fighting in its documents for protecting slavery. So we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to remember? And I know sometimes people get really on one side or another on this flag issue. So let's go a little bit further into that as we go into each of the questions. The last and most important question that I want to spend the most time on, because it has the most layers of complexity, is how remember. So let's go through to review how we got here to this point. We have why remember. So first we're debating significance. What's the significance? It does not always have to be a global significance. It can be a local significance if you're talking about a local forum. You have to look within the context of what you're looking at. Once we can discuss the significance, then we have to work through what is the history to be remembered. And you saw that could be challenging sometimes, but it's better to approach it with a question as opposed to, I know the answer already of what's the history to be remembered, and now that closes the doors for continuing to fill out the picture, as we saw in that portion. And then, of course, the third part, what does it mean to remember? So why remember? What is the history to be remembered? And what does it mean to remember? What are we doing in this context? What message are we sending? If we've made it through all of that, and now we're at the fourth question, then how do we remember? That is, how do we tell the stories? All the stories I shared with you so far are multi-layered, multifaceted. They have stuff in there that we're going to find repulsive today. They have stuff in there that we still love today. And many of these figures are very complicated. So how do you tell these stories? Well, we were just talking about the Confederate flag and Lee, so let's stick to that theme. There I am in the middle there with the Confederate flag at Gettysburg, giving a program on the generations of uses of the Confederate battle flag. It's been used in many different ways across the last 160 years. So as you can see, even from a young age, I was attracted to difficult topics. The topic I chose to present on, just purely on my own in an evening lecture that I did many times there, was on how the Confederate battle flag has been used since the Civil War. Not during, but since the Civil War, in many different iterations. You might hear the term heritage, not hate. You can't erase history. You might hear some of that. And that all may be true, but is not complete. Because while some folks may not mean it in a way that is meant to be intentionally hurtful, and I think this was especially true prior to 2015-16 with the roof shootings, I think it's become more difficult since then. But it may turn again. Look on the right side there. There's a Confederate battle flag being used at a water park. Often it was used in pop culture. You can remember TV shows that would put it up. Symbol of rebellion. Someone may be using the flag to symbolize their heritage. In Georgia, I had a friend who saw it as part of his heritage, even though some of his ancestors were enslaved. So very complex. But what's also part of the history is the way white supremacists, including the KKK, used it. So you can't pick and choose, right? So on the left side, you see the KKK hooding its leader as a Confederate battle flag, as one of the symbols it chose. Now you may argue this is an accurate depiction or not in the way they wanted to see the Confederacy. I'm not here to debate that, although we could have that in the Q&A if you want to, but my purpose here for the how remember is more, how did the KKK choose to remember the Confederacy? And when we tell the stories of the Confederate flag, how are we going to tell the stories that are multi-layered? It's not all one or all the other. But also, let's layer this, make this a little more complicated, even more so. What else is in that photo? The Christian cross and the US flag. Are those symbols of white supremacy by association? These are gray area questions that I want you to think about. So when we think about the story of how to remember, we're thinking about the many ways this can be complex, and the reason that matters is because then you can understand why the other person sitting across from you may disagree with you. Because maybe your understanding, while partially accurate, is not looking at the entire picture of the many different ways of how we could tell the story. So along those lines, how about Arthur Ashe? Going back to Monument Avenue. How about adding Arthur Ashe? So let's talk about different ways of how we can remember history, monuments, historic sites, etc. I want to show you a few different layers because it's never that straightforward. Monument Avenue, contested. Of course, the Confederate statues came down. But what about Arthur Ashe? One way to have dealt with that, as they did decades ago, was to add Arthur Ashe to Monument Avenue. That was contested at the time. Does it make sense? Does it fit the theme? Doesn't seem to fit. But then others said, we're trying to add so that we can continue to tell a further story. Obviously, the next generation did not see that as sufficient. And that's why we had the recent Monument Avenue situation that we did. So these answers can change. How do you tell the story? How to remember? The answer of how to remember was different when we added Arthur Ashe to Monument Avenue than what happened a generation later. So the how to remember question can also change over time. How about reenactments? Now, there are various versions of reenactments, not always accurate. There's also living history, which is more educational in purpose, whereas as opposed to reenactments tend to be commercial ventures. But look at that photo in the upper left. That happens to be from a living history demonstration, but there are reenactors that are at the living history demonstration. Look at the smoke. You can't see them very well, can you? Now imagine if you were standing there. Might that give you a better understanding of, now I understand why sometimes things on the battlefield are chaotic, because that's just one unit. Imagine hundreds of units firing, and maybe the soldier is not seeing anything or hearing. That might explain sometimes why you have decisions that don't make sense on the battlefield. How to remember, how to tell the stories. Even these live demonstrations can have, while sometimes can seem gimmicky and hokey, depending on how they're done, can also add layers of understanding. Now, just for fun, I included this photo, so you all see that, I live what I preach, I guess. I'm not a reenactor for a variety of reasons, but this right here is me as a 19-year-old in a uniform that fit me. I just found what fit me from the depository at the National Park Service. When I was first there at Gettysburg, they made us dress up in those wool uniforms and march across the battlefield and camp there for the night, which you cannot camp on the battlefield if you're a normal visitor. So we can get a tiny little sliver of the experience of the soldiers. Now, I did not march 30 miles prior to get into the battlefield, so I had it much easier. I was well fed, but it does show that even the National Park Service thought trying to give us some version of a taste is going to help us tell the stories in how to remember. How about memorials? Since we were just at Gettysburg, let's take a look at the memorials. There on the left, you have a portion of the cemetery at Gettysburg, which of course is where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. That's why I put Lincoln on there. How about that Pennsylvania memorial there that you see the columns and a couple of statues on there, and the man reading the names of all the Pennsylvania soldiers that fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. So you can tell that's a pretty big monument. You can tell by the scale, obviously, of the individual there. Is that a way to tell the stories? Memorialization. The graves that you see on the left, going back there for a moment, are unknown soldiers. Their identities are unknown in the cemetery. Union soldiers, but unknown identities. Just a portion of the 3,600 or so soldiers that were buried there after the Battle of Gettysburg. And of course, where Lincoln came to dedicate the Gettysburg Address. Look at the theme and memorialization there. They knew early on that they'd be memorializing this site because Lincoln came just 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg to dedicate the cemetery. And they'd already been working on the cemetery. To the Pennsylvania Memorial, which was a generation later to today. If you go there in this particular section, you're going to have a memorial type atmosphere. It's not the only way the Gettysburg folks tell the story. It's only about 80 some odd miles from DC, so easy to get to. But it is one of the ways. So again, dealing with the question of how to remember, how to tell these stories. How about this one right here? I'm at Gettysburg, and right nearby is the Bryan House. This is the home of the Bryan family, a free black family in southern Pennsylvania, where Gettysburg is, just 7 or 8 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line from Maryland. Of course, at the time, the line of slavery. These folks are free. But how to tell the story using this is a little bit different than others. For example, when Lee's army invaded the North, there's documentation of this, that they would often capture African Americans in the North, presuming, because of their skin color, that they are slaves, that they are, this term is escaping me now, the runaway slaves. And so essentially putting them back into slavery. Well, as you might imagine, Bryan did not want to be around to deal with that, as it became clear that the Southern Army was up north. So they took off before the battle began, and they were not captured. But the presence of that simple little home allows us to tell the story, to tell the fuller story of the battlefield, to tell the story of the causes and the racial tensions during the Civil War, not just who went where and who shot who. Different kind of resource, different way on how to tell the story. On the right side, you see 2 monuments. I highlight those 2 monuments as one of hundreds of examples on the battlefield at Gettysburg that were dedicated by the soldiers themselves. So look how many different layers of monuments we've talked about. Some of the monuments were dedicated by states inside the US Capitol. Some monuments are dedicated nationally. Others are dedicated by descendants. These are dedicated by the men themselves. I think that's worth noting. I asked the question of, well, how do I tell that story? Because this is the participants remembering themselves. That's a little bit different. Now you might imagine that also comes with politics. If you're going to memorialize yourself, you're going to make sure that your unit looks good. You want to be the reason that that particular area of the battlefield turned out in your favor. As you might imagine, a lot more Union monuments than Confederate monuments at Gettysburg because the Union folks won. Not going to want to memorialize so much when you lose at the battlefield. And there's other reasons and other politics behind it, but that's one of the big ones. But also what makes this complicated to me is I said earlier that historic sites are singular, meaning that there's only one battlefield of Gettysburg. There's only one White House of the Confederacy. But monuments, there's a ton of monuments to Lincoln, to Lee, to Martin Luther King, and they're not necessarily where that person went. Monuments are different. It's a depiction of an artist. It's a depiction of an artist that's commissioned by a group that is trying to portray a certain image, a certain message. That's why these questions come up. What does it mean to remember? So how do you tell those stories, right? But in this case, what if you merge the two? This is a case where the monument is at the historic site. It's not somewhere off-site, it's at the site. So now it adds layers to the story of how to tell the story, right? Because there is now the battle on that ground, the same ground that monument is on, and then the story of how the folks that participated memorialized the battle. It's a little different than you and me saying we should memorialize this particular unit or that particular unit or this particular subject matter or this particular person. It's a little bit different. Look at the array of how to remember just in this one photo. Just in this one photo on that one battlefield. Let's go to the atomic bomb, because that's where we started. Let's step back from the Civil War for a moment. Which atomic bomb do you remember? And how do you tell this story? Do you think of the destruction on the left? Or do you think of the exhilaration of victory on the right? As Jay mentioned, I have a book on the topic of remembering the atomic bomb. I'm putting it there so you know I talk about this stuff. You don't have to buy the book. If you want it, I'll send it to the U.S. Capitol Society. You can get it from them, or you can buy it from them. They can get the proceeds. So I'm not trying to sell you my book. Don't go on Amazon. My point here is to understand that when I worked at Los Alamos, during which I finished one of my theses and then later became the book, there was this question that came up because a national park, there was a question of creating a national park to Los Alamos, or not, excuse me, to the Manhattan Project that included Los Alamos, but is not limited to Los Alamos. But one of the reasons it got rejected in DC initially, eventually it would turn out to pass. But at the time that I was there, we didn't know. But one of the reasons it got rejected initially, to create Manhattan Project National Historical Park, because there was a question of, are we glorifying the atomic bomb by creating a national park to it? Now, with hindsight, we know eventually a national park was created. Is that a place where we can deal with the question of how to remember? Oh yeah. Is that a place where we have to deal with talking about the different layers and perspectives of how to tell the story? To tell both stories that you see here and others? I dealt all the time with folks that would come in, and I encountered all the time really strong emotions. The atomic bomb saved my grandfather's life. The atomic bomb is an example of evil in the world and destruction, and Oppenheimer is satanic. These are things that I heard. Now, of course, you may know that there are different national parks out there, 2 difficult sites, such as Manzanar, Japanese internment camp in California. Very recently, I think the newest one, is Amachi in Colorado, which was also a Japanese incarceration camp during the World War II. There are many examples. Sand Creek Massacre, also in Colorado, during the Plains Wars between some indigenous groups and the United States. So it's not that we avoid these stories in some of these, if you want to call them official historic sites, which a national park is a form of. But we have to deal with the question of how to tell these stories. And I think each of us, when we're dealing with something contested, one of the ways we can address this is, well, how do we tell the stories that are multi-layered? How do we interpret it? Here's another way to tell the stories. How about on the community history level? This is in Los Alamos. At the top, you have both photos are Fuller Lodge, which was there prior to the Manhattan Project during the boys' ranch school that was up there, Los Alamos Ranch School, which was established in the 19-teens or so, maybe 13, 14, 15, somewhere around there, and was there up until the Manhattan Project, which when the Manhattan Project came, it pushed them out. And they were basically, the easiest way I could put this is they were trying to create little Theodore Roosevelts, elites from the East Coast who were academically learning the liberal arts while also learning the rigors of the West and doing Boy Scout type activities. And so in the left there, in the black and white, you see a photo from the time period with the boys out there. And in the right, in the lower right, you see a photo that I took of the building still there as a community building where there's a job fair. I've gone to lectures there, weddings there, all kinds of current community events. So how to remember it? Is it always to turn it into a museum and put interpretive signs? Or is it to continue maybe to use the building in one of its original intents, which was a community gathering space? For example, the ranch school had 50 buildings and that was their gathering space. So it's always been a gathering space. How about doing a family reunion of sorts? This is me at the Descendants Day at the Monroe's home, Monroe's plantation, called Monroe's Highland. They gathered together a couple of different presidential properties, enslaved people's population. That does not necessarily mean they were direct descendants of the presidents themselves, but they were descendants of the properties that helped run the properties that were there. And there I am with some of the participants. Look at this family reunion atmosphere. There's food being served. And I'm going to play a quick video to give you a sense of the feel in the question of how these folks chose to remember that I was fortunate enough to be able to be a part of. Oops, I meant to stop the video and I stopped sharing. So last couple examples here. Now it's doing what I originally. How about food? We saw it in the previous section. Sometimes this applies to your family. There I am using food all kinds of ways, even shaving with peanut butter on one of the shows, because that's what George Washington Carver advocated, among other uses of peanuts and peanut butter. Whiskey in this case, the Whiskey Rebellion. You could have fun using food and connecting to the stories of how to remember. In this case, in the upper left, George Washington, and I used the question of how are you following George Washington's rules of civility for the 4th of July and how we can apply them today. Lower left, we actually cooked one of George Washington's recipes. Got it from Mount Vernon for Christmas. So food, another way on how to tell the stories, how to remember. You may do that with your family sometimes, maybe your grandparents' recipes or something like that. And so, as we kind of begin to kind of reflect on this, I want to point out a current program as we kind of begin to wrap up here in our last couple of thoughts. What you see there is the American Women Quarters program, and if you can see me on the camera, you'll see I have some of the quarters right here in my hand from the US Mint. There's a proof set. And if you look in your pocket, you'll see these quarters circulating in your pocket right now, very accessible. And these were an attempt to recognize historic women on the tail side of the quarter on the same platform as George Washington. It's going on for 4 years, 5 quarters a year, so that's 20 total. So it's still ongoing. I've been doing segments on every one of the quarters based on where the geography makes sense. And the one I have highlighted here on the quarter is Maya Angelou. Is that a different version of the American dream than, say, George Washington? Do we need both stories, though? I think we probably should, and how to remember. You also see Edith Kanakaole, a Hawaiian indigenous advocate, and I'm drawing a blank on her name now, Hovita Idar from Texas, who fought for Mexican-American rights. So it's a wide array that they're covering. But the point here is that, to me, what the quarter says is that there is room for both sides of the story. We can even put them on the same prop. And in fact, there could be more than 2 sides. It's just a quarter is 2-sided. There could be 3, 4, 5 sides, and we can tell the stories together when we talk about how to remember. And briefly, let's come back to the Capitol. Inside the Capitol, for example, we have these figures. George Washington, which you just saw on the quarter. Now, Lee came down, but Washington didn't, even though Washington was also a slaveholder. We can argue about the differences and similarities there, because there's a difference in fighting for the Confederacy. But you see, again, the questions are complicated. How about Charles Carroll of Carrollton, signer of the Declaration of Independence? He's on the right side there. Huge slave owner in Maryland. But also the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, and his family dealt with a lot of problems in Maryland for being Catholic, when Maryland went from a Catholic haven to then the turn against Catholics and then back fighting against it, and the Carroll family was always in the center of that. So Carroll may be frowned upon for owning slaves, but on the other hand, perhaps celebrated for religious freedom. So these questions are complicated. When we tell these stories, how to remember, we have to remember one of my historical heroes, George Wythe. There I am in front of the Wythe home in Williamsburg, Virginia. George Wythe is in the center there, the biggest portrait. One of my favorite historic sites, partly because it's so greatly intact. But one of the reasons I love it also is because the person associated with it. No, he wasn't perfect. But what I love for the purpose of our conversation here, when we reflect on these questions, is the fact that he tutored both Thomas Jefferson, who you see on the upper right, and John Marshall, who you see on the lower right. Why does that matter? Because if you study that period of American history, you know that Jefferson and Marshall hated each other. During Jefferson's presidency, Marshall was, of course, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and they clashed a lot. So how is it that the same tutor, the same person who taught them, produced two people that think so differently? That's why, to me, when I think about these questions on approaching contested sites, I remember George Wythe. Because it tells me that we can learn about these and about each other without having to talk to someone to necessarily proselytize that they should think like me, but rather understand that you can have both intelligent people, Jefferson and Marshall, believing different things. Now, how are you going to figure out how to constructively work together, even when you disagree? That when I talk to you, or even when I'm teaching, I'm not trying to make you believe what I do on the Confederate flag, or believe what I do about Charles Carroll, or believe what I do about the atomic bomb, but rather giving you the tools so that you can be like Jefferson and Marshall and have different perspectives and both be smart and both have a point. So how can we approach that? And I think the way we approach that is with questions rather than answers. And that's why the blueprint that I provide to you today is not a checklist of these are the things that you must have on each monument, on each historic site. To me, that's too close-ended, but rather it's open-ended, to provide a blueprint for discussion, to provide a blueprint that is open-ended dialogue, so we can take the different stakeholders, figure out how to integrate the different pieces together. This is me. If you want to hang out afterwards, you're welcome to contact me. There's my YouTube where I post my TV appearances after I go around, so that's how you can follow me around the country. My Instagram, if you want to just check out my adventures, get in touch, DM me, that's fine. And I am doing a Defining the American Dream tour where we deal with some of these questions, but at actual sites. If you want more information on that, you can check out that website there, raffisregulars.com. It's part of a series I do called Beyond the Postcard, where we dig beyond the postcard. We don't just go to the sites, we get behind the scene access, we get leadership of the site. I'll get an author or a director of a center to join with me so we can really dig deep in some of these big questions. Let's open up the Q&A.
And you'll have to stop the share.
There we go.
Great. So thank you very much for your thoughtful presentation. We thought it was important to kind of return to the Capitol and understand the framework for the National Statuary Hall collection, which is a very specific set. The National Statuary Hall collection is 2 statues from each state,
Yep.
selected by the state. And you spoke about Robert E. Lee, who has been removed, but he has not been replaced.
Correct.
Virginia has voted to replace him with Barbara Johns, who has been an educator, led the student protest that was involved with Brown versus the Board of Education. But that is in the dialogue and the conversation in the Capitol is one that is not specific, it's specific to the Capitol, but it engages the states. You showed the example of the Missouri statue that had been removed. It was replaced with Harry Truman.
That's right.
And
Isn't that funny? The atomic bomb. We were just talking about the atomic bomb, and there's the only person that's used it, and he's there.
so,
These things are
you know,
complicated.
think
Yeah,
think about this, that there is um, at the Capitol itself, there are many, many paintings, statues, monuments that take some conversation about our history. And one of the questions that, many people have put forward is, when we're not talking about specific, places, which you gave a lovely example of, lots of different places where history is interpreted across the country. But at the Capitol, where there are, certain frameworks, part of what we do at the Capitol Historical Society is tell the story of the time when the painting was placed, the time when the statue was put in. And the Capitol is both a monument, a museum, and an actual office building.
that's right.
So it's got a unique,
Additional layers of complexity. That's right.
when you talk about layers, the Capitol has a lot of layers, but many of our people, raise the question about, what is your thought about, should we try to preserve the Confederate monuments in some capacity in conversation with sort of the rest of the story? And if so, how would you propose doing that?
So I don't like blanket answers. My answer is perhaps, and it depends. It depends on the specific context. I'd have to walk through the questions because I really believe that the specific, I would say, for example, take Nathan Bedford Forrest, a different figure, one of the founders of the KKK, right? He was a Confederate general, became one of the founders of KKK. That's going to be a fundamentally different conversation than, say, Jeff Davis, for other reasons, who was initially actually against nullification, a unionist before the Civil War. So you got to walk through the questions. That's what's important. I'm not going to jump to an answer because each particular case is different of the why remember, the significance. What is a history to be remembered? I'm going to consider that. And of course, what does it mean? So in the context of where it is. Also, what's a depiction? If we took more time to look closer at some of the monuments, the depictions are sometimes very glorified or not, right? And that matters too. And then how are we telling the story, which is how are we interpreting it? How to remember, right? At Gettysburg, there are Confederate monuments. To me, that's a very different context, though. There are not many because they lost, but there are a few. That's a very different context than a Confederate monument, say, in the Capitol. I would also say there's a difference between a Confederate monument and a Lee monument, even though Lee was a Confederate. A Confederate monument is something like, glory be given to all the Confederacy and the cause for which it fought, for example. That'd be a Confederate monument to me. That's capturing the Confederacy as a whole. Lee is an individual who had many different components, including, of course, and most known for, leading one of the Confederate armies. So these are the contexts and questions that I'm going to consider before I have an answer for each of those. But no, I do not think we should always be removing Confederate monuments, but no, I do not think we should always keep them either. So if you're looking for me to say, is it possible to keep some? Yes, I do think it's possible, but it depends on the context. Are we at a museum? Are we at public grounds? Are we at a school? Are we in the Capitol? Where are we? And what is the story being told, and who's being depicted, and what's being depicted? These are all questions I need to look through. So that's why I created the question. So I would say it's possible and perhaps, but it depends. I might add one more layer to the Capitol. Of course, to what you said, Jane, that might be relevant here. Yes, there is Statuary Hall, right, which comes from the States. But as you know, not every monument at the Capitol grounds, inside or outside, is necessarily from within the program of Statuary Hall. And that also is a question that is going to me, influence what does it mean to remember. It's going to influence that because Statuary Hall is a specific purpose, which is a little bit different than what's the purpose of putting a monument somewhere else on the Capitol ground. So the details of the situation really matter. We can't come in with a preconceived answer and make the details fit. The details of the situation have to guide us to these to the points of discussion. That's why I provide a framework. Is that a fair answer? I'm not trying to evade it. It
Well,
depends.
I think anything is a fair answer because it's an opinion question. And, you know, I just wanted to clarify
Yeah,
because some of
yeah.
the statuary hall
But I don't
questions,
think there's a blanket answer. Yeah, I
some
don't
of
think
the
there's a blanket answer.
questions that we get asked a lot are about statuary hall because that is the
Sure.
most dynamic and
Absolutely.
ever changing. Whereas the statuary around the Capitol, um, they're they're not continually adding statuary around the
Sure. Yeah.
that is, and it's really more how we interpret the statues that are there and the work that is there. So there's a lot of what we have done and learned, you know, as we worked on understanding the role of enslaved people in building the Capitol,
That's right. That's right.
which, you know, until the mid 2000s wasn't even part of the conversation.
But Jane, you know what's funny about that is like this is why I say it's so challenging because sometimes we're chasing our tail. And what I mean by that is like let's pick on Truman. I mean, I just talked about the atomic bomb. And from my perspective, having worked at Los Alamos years ago, when they replaced Benton with Truman, I just thought it was interesting. It's kind of funny because I got so much feedback when I was in Los Alamos that Truman was terrible because he dropped the bomb. That I'm, it's not like he's this pristine figure. He's a contested figure too, for a different reason than Benton, who himself is complicated, that I pointed out. But it's not that simple because even the person that we replace him with does not necessarily, let's just say, fix the story. I just think we're probably a little bit less focused on the atomic bomb question in Missouri, who put that there, versus say where I came from. But that's a great example of we're kind of picking and choosing what we choose to remember, because if I chose to remember the atomic bomb, a transformative event for Truman, it's going to be a lot more complicated and contested, much like Benton, I think.
And it is clear that we could talk about this for another 6 hours, but we are near the hour, and we really appreciate, Raffi, the work that you do to bring history to life, bring the contested and complex history into a conversation that allows us to learn about each other and about our future. And we do believe at the Capitol Historical Society that understanding our history is something that is an ongoing process, because we learn about history every day. There are new, you know, there was a time when history was only about, you know, white men with property. And then lo and behold, we found out there were women in history. Lo and behold, we found out that there were indigenous people. We found out that there were enslaved people. And telling the whole story is something that we work very hard on. We appreciate all of you who joined us for today. We hope that you'll join us as we move forward. Each of these events is only possible because of the contributions and donations that come from our members and supporters. And we thank you so much for your continued support. And one of the ways you can support is not just by becoming a member, but by sharing this information with your friends and neighbors and inviting them